Our keynote interview today tackles a challenge that ought to resonate with everyone in this room. How do you take a legacy news brand with a decades-honed way of working and wrestle it into a new way of thinking of itself and of the news? How do you break up outmoded workflows and replace them with nimbler, multi-channel ways of working? How do you manage the cultural change inside that institution without which nothing will happen? And how do you do all of this without alienating your core but aging constituency? My two guests today are at the nexus of all those questions at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, a venerable public broadcaster with a storied history and tradition. Michael Gruzuk is the Senior Director of CBC News Studios, and Andree Lau is the Senior Director of Digital Publishing and Streaming. They are tasked with helping lead a major overhaul of a Canadian media institution, a process that has seen resistance, turbulence, and some success towards a reinvention that aims to make it relevant for younger generations for whom maybe now the CBC only has a more spectral role than its older consumers. And so no small job in front of them, and I'm very happy to welcome Michael and Andree. And I'm also very happy to sit down. So, Michael, let's start with a story of a fairly significant and perhaps even epic failure in some senses, The National. So here is CBC's flagship newscast. It's a national institution. And when veteran anchor Peter Mansbridge, who is as Cronkitean an anchor as Canada will ever have, decided to retire, CBC saw that as an opportunity to do a complete reboot, and you were part of that process. So let's just look at a really short clip of a promo, a sizzle for when the show was rebooted in 2017 first.
You're always asking questions. My position is to get the best answer for all of you.
We can go so much deeper. We're going to really take people through the nitty-gritty.
One of the things that drives us day to day on stories is this burning desire to either get an answer or set the record straight.
It's in our DNA to go find out, and you feel it very differently.
So from one anchor to four, among other things, Michael, can you describe just how dramatic a change you undertook and how the show ran and looked differently post-Mansbridge?
Yeah, thank you very much for having us here. It's interesting to look back. It feels dated to me to see that spot. That was a 15-second promo spot that ran in 2017. But the values that were embedded there are still alive and well in what we're trying to do across all of our newsrooms. We knew that we had a real opportunity with the departure of, as you said, our venerable news anchor, Peter Mansbridge, who is so respected. We did brand research and found he was the most recognizable person across our organization, but beyond entertainment and sports. And if you think about us as a hockey nation, that's pretty impressive. Like, he was more known than anybody. That's an opportunity. It's also a real dilemma. And we had to, face the facts of what we were losing with him walking out the door, and we wished him well in his retirement, and he's continued to still do special projects with us. But we had built all of our equity up in him for over 30 years. Every major news event you can imagine, you called it Cronkitean. So we had an opportunity to take that and say, where are our rising journalists who are known for a variety of different skills that are more in tune also with where we're going? Nothing against Peter, but more on the ground, immersive. I was listening to the previous panel, more cinematic journalism. Some of them are known for that. More pointed political journalism and conversation, more accountability. And we decided to invest in 4 different hosts, and it was very radical, to really focus on the journalism as opposed to the production of a typical nightly newscast. At the same time, all of our, the gravity in the organization from every decision in the newsroom, and I think some of this is probably still true to this day, we are a work in process, as every organization is, was geared towards the national. What does that show want tonight? And at the same time as that was happening, we were rising up to be the #1 digital news provider in the country, which we are still to this day. #1 podcaster. In all of these emerging spaces, we were connecting with those audiences, but all of our equity, all of our resources, all of our assignment systems were geared towards this newscast. So we could have just left it and replaced it with just one single anchor, which is, maybe you're going to reveal where we ultimately are now, because I recognize most people don't watch Canadian news every day. If you do, good for you. But we've been on a journey, but the values that we started with from that brand spot still feel very true.
So you talked to sort of the 1 to 4 there, and that. But how are you trying to see and reboot this newscast itself with fresh eyes?
You know, I was listening to the previous panel, and everything does come back to people connect with story, not with a time slot. There's a lot of behavior that's connected with time slot, and we respect that audience. But we were looking for opportunities to connect with story that could move across the day, weeks, months, even. And we're moving into that space now. So, what could we capture with the different hosts that we had, and how are they creating essentially a body of work constantly that's being added to? And that's what we found with the 4 hosts. And they are all still, there's only one host that is now on the national. It's been quite a journey. But the 3 other hosts are still connected to the program or now have their own programs. So we were able to really amortize the power of these 4 new personalities as the faces of a changing news organization, and also a changing Canada, which was a big part of what we were thinking about.
So spoiler alert, they changed the news, the flagship product, radically in 2017, and viewers and critics did not take kindly to this reboot in many ways. Characterize, if you would, the reaction that they had.
Well, there were multiple reactions. The core audience struggled with that radical of a change. At the same time, we were seeing growth in new audiences in digital spaces. And as we know, most people in most news organizations, you're going to meetings where the kind of metrics being measured are really up for debate all the time. What are we measuring? What is success? And ultimately, we feel like we found a point of balance a few years on, where we have grown in those digital spaces with the content that the program's created. But we did have to make some changes to the format of the program to still deliver a singular voice, and that's where we are now. Do we want to play the little bit with
let's...
It's a bit like Survivor. I shouldn't say that because it has been a difficult challenge, but one of the people that you saw in that first one is now, and was named officially this year, our chief correspondent.
Yeah, let's look at the most recent sizzle.
What is your biggest worry for her right now?
People started running, and here come the riot police.
It's probably not very safe. It may be all that they've got.
I'm Adrienne Arsenault. This is The National.
So from 4 to 1. Now, I bring, of course, there's a major aesthetic change with the show. Graphics package very, very different. Just the whole flow of the show changed fundamentally. But I wanted to start the conversation with this example, not to hash through history that at this point is a few years old, but to get a sense of what it taught CBC in terms of calibrating change when you're talking about the core product, both inside the newsroom and among viewers. So as you look back now at this process and where you are in it, how do you assess what damage was done and what gains were made?
There was trust with the staff in strategy that I've learned a lot from. And you can almost see yourself as having multiple different audiences, and one of those important audiences is your team. And within that team, there are multiple different teams. There's the actual team on the program. A lot of the people on the program also shifted. And then across our organization, we're the largest media company in Canada, with bureaus across Canada, obviously, and in several places around the world. And people were along for the ride. What I learned that as soon as there were headwinds, people were very cautious about stepping into that and through it. And what I learned is, and I'm not just saying this because I sit here now 5 years later, I learned that we were right, but we were too fast. All of the values around looking for how we take our brand and spread it out beyond a destination newscast, how we have the kind of storytelling and very raw journalism that can live in the multiple spaces that you were discussing on the previous panel, how we have to also capture the changing face of Canada and really speak and have conversations about the news in a less authoritative way. Those are all true, and they remain embedded in the success that we've started to find again now that we've recast it around one host, but also all of the work that we're doing in video with Andree and that we're moving into in streaming. So the values remain the same, but the pace of change was aggressive especially for a country like Canada that really likes to kind of just move a little bit more slowly and make sure everybody's okay with everything.
Right. So Andree, there's none of this particular blood on your hands. given that you came into your current role after the national reboot happened. But that said, more than a few people inside the CBC probably look a bit askance at what you're trying to do at the organization. So can you explain the change that you're meant to be shepherding through in terms of what the news product looks like and how it's iterating?
Sure. So my portfolio is digital publishing and streaming. And really it's to align Canada's biggest media organization to connect the dots. And it's really to give our content, our great journalism, a broader platform and discoverability and distribution, as everyone is trying to do. But I think there's a lot of culture work with our teams internally to really clearly explain our strategy and the end goal, which is to reach wider audiences. And to really explain, like, no one's losing anything. Like, the journalism and the foundations always stay the same, but how does that look, what does that look like? You know, if I work on a 6 p.m. newscast, how do I fit in? Because there is this mentality of, well, that's that new project over there and has nothing to do with me. And there's a reason my portfolio is not siloed in linear TV or audio or radio or digital. It's just streaming. And we mean that in the broadest sense of the term. And it includes social, it includes digital, it includes one-minute packs, you know, and it's all about the endpoint and just reaching as wide an audience as we can, because that is our public mandate as a broadcaster.
Which tees up nicely. I think we need to stop and kind of have a little bit of context for this organization, because we need to emphasize that at this point, this is a public broadcaster we're talking about. And so it's not necessarily operating under all of the same business rules as your private competition. Now, there is advertising on CBC's television, not on its radio. And so, but it has a mandate. And so can you speak a bit to how your organization's mandate is dovetailing into this kind of reinvention
Absolutely.
that you're trying to?
I mean, at the core, our mandate is to reflect Canada to Canadians in the most accessible way possible. So it dovetails because we need to provide our content and our journalism to wherever they are. That is part of our job. You know, our mandate includes contributing to a shared national identity. And so we need to make sure people see themselves represented and that their issues are reflected and that it's relevant to them. We are not expecting younger, diverse audiences to come to our flagship newscast at a certain time, or that we have live, amazing breaking news. So we need to be where they are. And streaming is one of those places. You know, we know that young, diverse audiences have different habits, and they also don't see themselves reflected in a traditional way of how we present news, with reporters, with men in suits. And so that is part of our mandate, to continue to reflect contemporary Canada particularly. And Canada's a vast, huge place. So there's also a geographic and regional reflection that we have to do. So it is a big job, but you know, we're using our tools and expanding how we reach people.
And I have seen reporters in hoodies on CBC.
Yes.
I don't know if that's
I
sanctioned.
think you will in a minute when we show
Oh,
something
yes,
else.
yeah, that's,
Yes.
that's true.
Yeah.
But on the national,
Yeah.
I've seen hoodies.
We did brand research, which is eyeball-inducing, and it's not the only thing that you look at, but they did compare us to a hospital waiting room in terms of the brand relationship. And everyone goes to the hospital waiting room when something's wrong, and that has proven to be true. We also have the #1 news channel in Canada, CBC News Network, which is under Andree's purview right now, which, by the way, also brings in a significant amount of revenue based on the way it works with cable in Canada. So even though that we had that strength in those moments, we knew we know that people don't want to go to the hospital waiting room. They go all the time because they have to. So there are some hoodies now.
Right.
And there's much less, as we say, sort of voice of God authority from a public broadcaster that, modeled after other public broadcasters like the BBC, does inhabit this space in people's lives that is a bit like an uncle or a grandpa or an auntie, I suppose.
I use a great aunt.
A great
That's
aunt,
my
and I said
analogy.
uncle.
Like
Okay.
a great aunt you call a couple of times every year to wish her Merry Christmas and Happy Birthday, but we're not like the trusted friend that you go to with any questions without judgment. And I think that's sort of the analogy I have in my head of
Sort of
relevance.
obligatory kind of fealty, but
Yeah.
not passionate love.
Not passionate love. Well, we created, we now have the #1 daily news podcast in Canada called Front Burner. And the values we were looking for when we cast about for a host was smart best friend. And her name's Jamie Poisson. She has now inhabited that space for Canadians, like someone who's a little smarter than you want to hang out with in the morning. And those are values that we're seeing audiences want because they assume that the trust and the knowledge and the facts are already there. We're fortunate in terms of where we're at with that in Canada.
So at the core of what you're trying to do is to think about content creation in a smarter way. So it's not just about churning out stories without thinking about their final destination, but creating a story with a view to the fact that it will have multiple different platform destinations. And so those are going to necessitate perhaps different iterations if you want to connect successfully with different audiences there. So I'd like both of you to speak to this. And I think it's going to connect with some points that we just made in the last panel, obviously, too. What does this pragmatically look like from the point of a story assignment or its generation all the way through to the workflow and distribution? How do you make that kind of different story construction?
So it's not perfect. It's a constant struggle to untie your habits of how an assignment meeting is run, for example, or the questions you ask. We tend to say, well, what's new? What's the hook? Versus what are people actually talking about? Or how do we show that we get that we care and we want to talk with them and not at them? And then you look at format. But we're not there. We're trying and we're working on it, and it's a journey, I think Michael's favorite word, because it speaks to like the previous panel talked about versioning, right? And it's all of that stuff. Like instead of thinking we need to get a 2-minute pack to the 6 p.m. newscast, we're starting to think about, okay, let's gather for social because we know that will have the biggest impact. And let's put that in its form on the 6 p.m. People get it. They get that vertical video was shot that way. They're not going to say, oh, my TV is off. Like the habits and the expectations are different now, and we have to be okay with that. So I think it's a letting go of a lot of what we thought was the right way to assign or gather, and give permission to our teams to have those discussions and to try slightly different things and to realize that the audience knows what we're doing. And there's a transparency and a trust there that we need to keep building on.
Is there pushback when you kind of adopt some of the, like using vertical video still?
I mean, of course.
Yeah. I think that teams, what we've been grappling with, I think a lot of organizations would be, is it's fun to do the new stuff, but we haven't taken any of the old stuff away. And that's a resource conversation. It's a gravity conversation in terms of the morning meetings that happen every day. And we're right at a point right now where we're really pivoting around different values across the day around, live matters, live connects, live matters in multiple places, in Andree's world, on News Channel, on our news app, but on demand increasingly matters as well. And what we're finding is that there's this mushy middle that we continue to inhabit. And a lot of work is going into, I call it this mushy middle of end of day stories that really don't have any legs. They don't do particularly well based on the data, and we heard that on the previous panel, data speaks. Yet we continue to assign those kinds of stories every day.
What kind of stories, for instance?
So news summaries that maybe have a few expert clips in them. It's the classic North American model that we're all quite familiar with probably a bit of a long-winded intro, which is unnecessary in this day and age. If you have a host of a program, you can just get into the crux of the story. And then the few kind of basic stakeholders. Everybody knows and has seen these sort of like Charlie Booker kind of like send-ups of what the typical news package would have. And we still, and it isn't the fault of anybody, we still have to fill newscasts, and those kinds of packages are being created. But what we're learning, and I think we're not unique in this, is that that's neither a live proposition, it's a news summary, nor is it something that has any legs to be consumed for more than possibly that night. I call it the Cinderella syndrome. It sort of expires at midnight and has no use again. I'm speaking only in the video space. And so that's a mushy middle that's taking up a lot of resources, and we're asking questions. What could we assign today on the state of interest rates that is going to be applicable in all of the spaces that Andree oversees, so that we could embed it in a story 2 days later, 3 days later, 4 days later? It is a journey. We are not there, but we're starting to have those conversations and actively talking about devaluing deadlines connected to appointment viewing, which is a radical conversation to have, and with all due respect to the end-of-day newscasts, we have to start to shift our conversations, and this is more at a strategy level, and I recognize I'm speaking to a lot of leaders, so I would say that we're even cautious about how boldly we say this to our own staff, but we need to be talking about what the audience needs from us when, and a lot of audience wake up and need something from us first thing in the morning. They're not waiting until 10 o'clock at night to see a quick little explainer on interest rates or what have you. And so those are pretty bold shifts for an organization that has all of its history tied up in delivering something by the end of the day.
Let's come back to versioning. Is it an essential part of this process? Let's start with that question. Is versioning ultimately, do we have to have a certain version of a piece for social platforms that are going to be different from a fast channel iteration or a linear?
I think you can't avoid it, but I think in our organization, it's what do you mean by versioning? And I think a big shift for us is when we say versioning, people tend to think I have to have one version for every platform that we're on. And we're being much more deliberate and intentional to say it's okay if this is only on linear and YouTube, because we know this piece of content will hit those two target audiences and then leave it. It doesn't have to be on Instagram. It doesn't have to be embedded in a digital text story. Like, those are the intentional conversations that haven't really been happening until this point on a really broad scale.
So not every story has to go to every destination.
That's right, and that's, again, for an institution like ours, that's a big shift. And I did want to jump on, the kind of storytelling that's changing. Like, even at the national, they're doing some cool, smart, audience-led changes to visual storytelling, and it's being led by someone whose background is in social, and that's also a bit of a change, that's not being led by someone with a strictly linear TV background. So,
what do you mean by an audience-led story? Can you define that?
It's the social way. You get the gold first. You see the reunion at the airport first, right? On social, that's how we've created that irresistible pull, and then you tell the story, and then you replay the emotional reunion again. Whereas I argue linear TV builds, right? It's that whale structure. And so it's breaking down, it's not just a social convention, it's just a great storytelling convention. Let's just do it. So things like that.
So versioning is very time consuming because you've got to, it's labor hours, and there's no way around that to a certain degree, except for where technology might come in to help with that. Have you found any preferred tools that are really indispensable in creating a more efficient versioning process?
I was worried you were going to ask this question because there isn't one tool. I think that if we were looking at our stories based on everything being output to multiple places all at once, which I understand is a dilemma that a lot of organizations are looking at and companies are engaged in. We're not there. We are, as Andree said, embracing much more asymmetrical distribution based on the platform and the audience. There are dream unicorn stories. I'm thinking of a story that one of our reporters did where he got embedded in a NATO surveillance flight over Ukraine just a few months ago. I mean, it was incredible. The kind of footage and the immediacy of what you were seeing in that piece worked perfectly at an end-of-day newscast that my mother is watching, as well as the kind of thing that my kids are accidentally checking out in all of the social spaces that we are. Because right away, you're immersed in a story. There's not a lot of voiceover. As I say, there's no poetry off the top. I have a bit of a battle against poetry. It just slows everything down. And so there are those dream dream scenarios.
Poetry? What does that mean exactly?
Holding the audience's hand through everything, as opposed to letting them experience it directly. And so when you have those sorts of stories that just start right there in an airplane over Ukraine looking for Russian missiles, you don't need a lot of poetry. The audience gets what's happening.
Just start in the story.
But we do not have those assignments. I believe that our assignment system assigns roughly 70 stories a day across the country in TV. And so I recognize I'm speaking about, as I said, unicorns that only happen possibly there's one story a day across the entire system that lends itself to versioning so naturally.
So I know you said emphatically that you're finding your way through this and there's no answer yet per se, but what is the best formula that you've found so far to most efficiently attack multi-platform story conception and distribution both in terms of the workflow changes and the tools that you're going to start to use throughout the process that you might not have done before?
Well, I'll look at what we're doing in streaming, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. We've just launched a new streaming channel, a free streaming channel, and we're intentionally looking at some workflows connected to the programming that's there. We care about the programming, but what we're actually doing is trying to embed some learnings to your question around assignment that is much more portable, has more of a shelf life, can work on a supper hour or end of day newscast, but also works in YouTube, also works on some of the original programs that we're creating on the streaming channel. So it's refreshing to work in a sandbox where we're saying what do we need and what do we need to learn, which is a lot of the questions that we're asking. And again, it is coming down more to story assignment that is supported by technology than technology that's guiding story assignment there.
Is there an example, not to put you on the spot,
Sure,
but is
sure.
there one recent thing you could point to?
Yeah, I mean, we have in our nation's capital, Ottawa, our local host, almost all of our hosts are increasingly reporters that also host, as opposed to hosts that sometimes report. So they go out and they do stories. And he did a very local story about what was happening with housing in his neighborhood, literally in the cul-de-sac where he lives. And it has been able to stand up and work on one of our new streaming programs that's been in high rotation so we can repeat it multiple times. But it also ran on his newscast that night. He was able to distribute it in social. And it was shot differently using, drones and all the fun stuff that when you have more than 8 hours, you can actually put some time into. And we're looking at more models like that because there's a culture piece to this as well, that people need to see examples of what's achievable and need to see it from leaders in the organization. So the fact that he's the host of that newscast and he was doing that storytelling and taking that risk, so it's helping in terms of technology, in terms of culture, and in terms of distribution, because that story went in multiple places as opposed to only in the Ottawa local market, where it would have run 2 years ago had they done that.
And Andree, I meant to ask you this before, but would you mind explaining for everyone how this is not a network affiliate model, as we typically have, so just how the CBC works in that way?
It's, I guess, one CBC is the best way to explain it. We work very closely with our local stations and the stations with each other to share content. Their stories could run on a network, the network digital site, as well as the local site, on the local newscast, as well as on network newscasts, and they share content across. We really play off the universal themes and the mandate that coming back to what does it mean, what does it look like to be Canadian, to live in Canada. And so there's a lot of collaboration. The mandate is the same, and our best practices are the same. We follow the same, obviously, journalistic standards and practices.
And when you say there's a lot of collaboration, how does that pragmatically happen? How do those projects, or is that a daily kind of?
Content is shared. Sometimes assignments, if there's a breaking news, as we saw in Saskatchewan a couple months ago, terrible stabbing spree, then we all double down on the resources because we have to. So we blend national and local resources in order to get that news across to all of the platforms that we need to.
Okay. So, while we're talking just about content creation, one of your objectives is to promote more immersive news storytelling. So what does that look like? How do you get to what does that mean, and how does it pragmatically look?
We get out of the studio as much as possible. So as I said earlier, studio-based live or with field reporters live is one aspect, but as we move into this on-demand space with more evergreen storytelling, and when I say evergreen, I mean a story that stands up for a couple days or a couple months, and there's a sliding scale there. But really creating that storytelling that is not connected to, as I said, the kind of expiration date formats that existed in our newscast before. So our chief correspondent, Andree Lau, who you saw in a helicopter in the Philippines there, embodies that. That's why she has the job. That's why she's on major assignments with more frequency than any host we've ever had in our history, because she is invested we are invested, her producers, her executive producer are invested in that kind of immersive storytelling to constantly be living the promise to go there and be there, which we also believe is a unique offer that we have as the public broadcaster in a day and age, especially as we look at hard to reach places of Canada. There are hard to reach places of Canada. Our commitment to the north is major, as well as international. Adrienne's been back and forth to Ukraine several times. And she doesn't go there and just performatively stand there. She really, for a chief correspondent, she stands there in a Patagonia puffy with her hair looking a little frizzy, and I can say that, and she'll probably appreciate it, because she does it. She says, I don't want my hair to look perfect. I'm in Ukraine. So that's the commitment that we have. And audiences embrace that very much. There's a value, I don't mean to get too philosophical, but there's a Canadian value around sort of no BS and authenticity that people are really connecting with Adrienne right now in particular with that storytelling.
She is not chained to a desk.
She is not chained to a desk, and she wouldn't want the job if she was. She constantly says, I need to get my boots dirty.
What do you think of as your priority platform at this point? Is it TV? Is it streaming? Is there not a principal platform?
It's wherever people are finding us.
It's not TV at the top of the chain.
No.
Okay.
Well, what is TV right now? I mean,
Yeah.
everyone in the room would agree with that. I mean, TV is streaming, and it is the future, and it's totally the past based on the way we created it. So we're in this circular conversation where, in conversations with our staff, we're even stopping ourselves with, they're saying, well, I thought you said digital first. It's like, well, kind of digital is everything now, so it's no longer digital first. It's streaming first. What do you mean streaming?
And that's where we like to say audience first, because we
right.
really need to get out of our heads and our habits in newsrooms and really think about where our audiences are finding us.
I have haughty friends who say they have no TVs. Look at your laptop. You have a TV.
That's TV, yeah.
Let's talk about streaming specifically. Michael, do you mind just enumerating where CBC currently has a streaming presence?
Well, we have a streaming service called GEM, which is free. It has levels of subscription if you want an ad-free experience as well, and it does fairly well across Canada. So we've already been streaming there all of our news and our news channel, which you can get as well. But we knew that we had an opportunity to move into the fast space and the free ad-supported space. So we just launched a new channel, free everywhere. Well, in a growing number of places, I would say, because there are a lot of business deals that we're still working on. And it launched on November the 30th. And it's already providing a tremendous amount of data for us as we learn. And it's available on Roku actually in the US as well. We'll be on some more connected TVs shortly. And of course, our news app is the #1 news app in the country, and it's embedded right there every day and in stories and on our site. So really, as Andree said, the new channel is where you are. We're not asking you to come to it. It's been a dilemma for our marketing teams because they are used to saying where exactly you're supposed to get it. And we're like, the audience will figure it out. It's sort of free everywhere. As we say in podcasting, wherever you get your podcasts, wherever you stream.
So, and we're going to talk more about that in just a moment, but how would you encapsulate your streaming strategy globally at this point? I understand you have a 3-year plan.
For Explorer, or for Explorer specifically, or for
No,
streaming
for the
in general?
entire streaming ecosystem.
Yeah, so we're kind of doing a chicken and the egg because we know that video storytelling has to evolve, and so we're using the FAST channel and streaming destinations to sort of be like, what are those audiences expecting? How can that influence how we change, how we create the content and also distribute it? And with that 3-year plan comes looking at how, again, previous panel, efficiencies in assignments, in roles. What can we stop so that we can tell people to start doing things? I think that's really key for a legacy institution like ours. And so we have one FAST channel. Are we going to look at another one, a couple more, to really leverage our local news programming? Where else would we be expanding? We just launched a TikTok after much deliberation. And I want to plug it because I think it's such a smart play. We are highly trusted. And so our CBC News TikTok specifically takes questions that audience is asking us and then leverages our journalists and producers to answer it in a very authentic way to TikTok.
Does one person own that, or do you have
We have a team that owns it, and there's one full-time person dedicated to it, but basically we are seeing the entire network of journalists that we have as subject matter experts who we're going to feature.
I'm curious.
But it's going to be that TikTok person that creates it in that way, right? It's not cutting and pasting how we would normally do it.
Was that person internal, or did you have to hire?
Internal.
Okay, interesting. Well, let's look at, so CBS News Explorer is the new FAST channel, just launched, as Michael said. Let's take a quick look at this channel.
What the heck is going on? We're all about explaining and expanding on the news. It's really
one that we see come up over and over.
Welcome to my neighborhood.
Did he or didn't he? Everybody loves a whodunit.
Getting on the same wavelength as other people, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Does it taste good?
It's really good for your bowels.
We'll get that off camera.
It's really interesting. So you got a little bit of a range. One more stop. I'll see you there.
Our editor put in "Hello, New York" because he was excited. He didn't get to come.
Now, I saw Boku hoodies in that little bit just now. Yeah. So, Michael, what is the appeal of FAST? And why? I mean, we're hearing a lot about FAST channels now. Everyone is very excited. It's a big buzzword. But what's the utility value of FAST for CBC?
A few things. A, we just want to learn. And so what you're seeing in that is very different from what the traditional CBC News brand is. It's aimed very deliberately at younger audiences. It's much more casual. It's much more evergreen content. And we know how well we do in live and breaking. We're constantly learning and improving what we're doing there. As I said earlier, we have CBC News Network, which is the most watched Canadian news channel and has had a record couple of years. Partly, of course, due to the dramatic news events, but also due to it doubling down on live and breaking, which means that we're not learning in some of these new spaces or about some of these new audiences. So we're being very deliberate around the different kind of content that you're seeing there. That the content captured in that sizzle reel and the tone of it, it's a particularly light tone because it's all at the beginning and everyone's excited. But we're able to learn and go to different corners of the ice. I'll make another hockey metaphor for you, so that we can learn because we've been all at the center of the ice, if you will, learning about live and breaking and responsive and 24-hour news. And so we're learning there. We're also learning about data, multiple new data points that are going to be coming in. We already have some of them, as opposed to looking at our traditional overnights and then looking at digital numbers separately. So the entire process for us is about learning, and we've said that we expect that the schedule for the FAST channel should change radically within 3 months and 6 months. And if it doesn't, then we're making mistakes.
So I'm interested in the programming there. You've got some original programming that is solely running on the FAST channel. Why have any originals run there at all? I mean, what's the rationale? What do you hope by putting bespoke content just on a FAST channel?
So a couple of things. We already have a very successful live breaking channel, so we didn't want to replicate that. The value prop here is showcasing context and explainers, the expertise, like you saw our meteorologist, Joanna Wagstaff, she's amazing, doing a climate show. So the bespoke is a challenge to our staff. Be creative, try new things. What else can we do with our expertise that we haven't done already? Two, we're expecting a new audience that may not even know CBC at all. So it gives them some freshness. At the same time, we are also programming our successful journalism programs that have been around for decades, the Fifth Estate, Marketplace, The National, amazing award-winning programs. And we're putting them there because we're exposing them to a new audience that may be drawn by the bespoke, and there's a combination. They get it. They can see what we're about and what we can bring to them, and really showcase the journalism.
Now that journalist we saw, Andrew Chang, that's sort of the signature program that's on this channel?
Yeah, he has a new daily show called About That, and it's at 11 a.m. because we were seeing data we had a beta version of the FAST channel that's been running for about a year, I guess, or maybe a little longer, and we were seeing numbers it wasn't at 6 o'clock or at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, it was around 11 or 12. So he has a daily explainer show around a major thing in the news, very casual, really portable right into YouTube and soon other spaces. And then it just repeats a few times that day. So we're really repeating a lot on the schedule and learning, and we will keep moving things around.
Is that show available on other platforms too, or did you decide just to keep it on the Fast channel?
It's on the Fast channel as well as on demand on a variety
Gem.
of places and on Gem. Yeah.
And segmented on YouTube and on CBCNews.ca and the News app.
Okay. And by the way, we may have time for one or two audience questions, so be thinking about that. We're going to send I think we have a microphone we'll send around in just a moment. Before that, just want to ask you, what's your thinking about how a streaming-only news show ought to look, as opposed to one that might be on linear? What different expectations visually do you think that audiences have there?
Well, I don't think people watch something and think that's a great streaming show. I think they watch it and they think that's a great show. So we're definitely trying to have a different approach with the tone of our journalists, the conversational nature. We're asking them to push themselves. As Andree said, Johanna Wagstaff literally eating dirt in the forest as she's learning about the climate change. That is not happening right now on the 6 o'clock news. So we're learning things about form and approach and style, but we want them to be great programs and not have the audience think about the fact that they're watching it on a streaming channel or that they're watching it on their phone, that it's just content that they'll watch wherever they watch it.
Are you learning things you think might obtain to the National down the road?
Well, the National's already been a leader in this for the last few years with some of that immersive storytelling, or really just getting into the crux of the story, which they've had as a data project, and so that's really helping us. And we're all, a lot of companies, and with the team that I run, we sometimes run these very bespoke, siloed innovation projects. The place that we're in right now as we move into the next year at the organization is everybody is engaged in these projects. There isn't a separate team that's working away on it, and that model works well, and it actually is very successful because you can control it and build a culture. But what I've observed a lot over the last several years with some struggles along the way that we've spoken about today is that to have that wholesale change, you need to get everyone engaged, which means it's slower, but there is a momentum, I think, across the organization from people who would identify as traditional linear or digital or broadcast or whatever title they had given themselves. I don't think there's anyone that would say that in some way they aren't feeling a part of this.
Do we have a question?
Yeah, what's your relationship with the programmers of the traditional CBC in terms of at what point will About That become a program on big CBC, and and where is that going to go with them?
We went through this with audio. We've talked about digital video and television a lot today, but we're also Canada's most listened to radio network, incredibly strong. And so, of course, like everybody, 5 years ago, we moved into podcasting. And those questions were being asked at the time. And not surprisingly now, a lot of those podcasts are sitting in the traditional radio schedule. So I expect that the same thing will happen as things open up. We essentially have 3 channels now. We have our main CBC channel, we have CBC News Network, and we have now CBC News Explore.
Would they say the same thing? In other words, would the big CBC people say, oh yeah, we're going to start to take their stuff?
They are absolutely watching closely and very supportive. And when you ask about they are us in a way. We have the news organization is incredibly valued and is at the main programming table for CBC.
Don't let their youth fool you. I think the grown-ups are in the room here right now. They are the they. I think we have one more question here.
Hi. So you mentioned strong collaboration between the national and the local. I'm just curious to get some insight, both from a technological or from even a process or workflow standpoint, how you share that content back and forth, the curation, what's the decision-making that goes behind what plays national versus what plays local?
That's a great question.
Honestly, it's all tied up in the assignment system. I wish it was a technology answer. Right now, everything runs through our main assignment meetings, and it is exciting for local right now because of CBC News Explore and the incredible reach. Our YouTube reach is significant. Well, globally, actually, obviously, we're aimed at Canadian audiences. So it's mostly an assignment conversation, and then a destination conversation with Andree's team around where else can things go, because had you been a local reporter even 5 years ago and you wanted it to be seen outside of where you were, where you lived, if it's, let's say it's Vancouver, it was very difficult because the obstacles were sometimes held up in just one or two people who would say that it could or could not be on a featured on the main newscast or somewhere high up in a story. And the opportunities are really opening up and quite endless for local to be seen by people everywhere. And we're finding, it's early days, that very local, hyper-local stories about British Columbia are interesting in New Brunswick and vice versa. And I observe this in the US market as well. I consume a lot of content and things that might seem very local, you can see how there's a universality to them. So
a lot of groups are trying to do that, you know, with across their footprint to share those stories. Let me ask a last question here, and Andree, I would like you to take this first, please, and Michael, if you want to add to it. In terms of general organizational cultural and technology at CBC, where are you finding the toughest parts of change management? Where are those problems, and how are you starting? You know, that's your remit now, so how are you starting to unpack them?
It's classic change management, the fear of what am I losing? And I think it comes down to that being the biggest work, is being clear that we're not taking anything away from people, and in fact, we're giving you a bigger platform, broader distribution. It's so that more people can see our work, and that just speaks to our mandate. And so really addressing the fear of loss and what's to be gained, and to have a really clear direction and goals and strategy that's measured, and to repeatedly tell people, we have your backs. You know, we're not just dumping this on you, we're in it together. And that's really the biggest, it's the people piece for me.
Michael, you want to add to it?
I totally agree with Andree. If people ask me what I'm worried about our people all the time. This is a fun conversation. But as we start, from the beginning of where you started asking us through to where we are now, all of the bumps along the way are where we got culture pieces wrong, or we misjudged them in the moment. So I couldn't agree with Andree more.
I think the CBC is a really special place. The journalists are there because they want to be. They believe in the mandate. They're not there to get rich or to be famous. And I think it's using that to remind everyone, like, that's our purpose, that's why we're here, and we just want to show more Canadians more of our work.
So you can check out their work. CBC News Explorer is available here in the US, and so I encourage you to take a look and see some innovation in practice there. Thank you so much to Andree Lau and Michael Gruzuk for being here today.
Thank you.